What up, meatheads? This is Travis, American Butcher, and this is the Meat Block Podcast. This is the weekly podcast by butchers for everybody. And if you're just joining us, welcome. And if you're returning, welcome back. And before we get started, I just want to ask that you please head over to iTunes or any podcast rating device and please leave a 5-star and please leave a comment. In this episode, we're going to be talking about butchers, but not the front of the house, not that person that you see behind the beautiful counter. We're going to be talking about the ones that aren't in the limelight. We're going to be talking about the secret butcher. And who's the secret butcher? He's not the guy fucking your wife. Well, he may. And if it's okay if you're a cuck. But in this episode, we're going to be talking about the people behind the scenes, not secret in the mischievous sense. We're going to be talking about the hidden. We're going to be talking about the butcher that's unseen, the one you will never meet, who may not speak English and doesn't give a fuck how it tastes to you, and who is not going to give you cooking advice. And without any further ado, here's the meat block.
Good cutting enhances the quality of good meat. In his way, the meat cutter is an artist. Poor cutting results in an inferior piece of meat, regardless of quality.
If you're like me and you are on social media, there's a lot of accounts out there that I follow, and I see, the hashtag butcher, and you just see what that brings up. And when I was starting out in the slaughter, when I was doing slaughter, I didn't use the terminology slaughterman, and the cutters at the facility were called butchers, and they had a smugness and an arrogance about them where they were like, talked down to us on the kill floor. And in my opinion, back then and still to this day, that we were doing a very important job. And my boss would always tell customers and clients that he had the best butchers around in New England. And he was talking about the cutters. He wasn't talking about me. He wasn't talking about the person slaughtering. He wasn't talking about the knocker or the vis. And people would ask me, in social situations, what I did for a living. And I didn't have that much pride in saying that I was a slaughterman. Now I say it with pride and puff my chest up and all this other shit. But back then, I would say I work as a butcher. And I didn't want to lie, so I typed in the definition, or I typed in the word butcher on the internet and, looked up the definition. And the first one was a retail or wholesale dealer in meats. I was like, well, that's very vague. I'm not a dealer. I'm not a seller. So I don't know if that applies to me. Unsatisfied with that result, I kept searching. And I like the Wikipedia definition. A butcher is a person who may slaughter animals, dress their flesh, sell their meat, or partake with any combination of these three tasks. They may prepare standard cuts of meat and poultry for sale in the retail or wholesale establishment. A butcher may be employed by a supermarket, grocery store, or butcher shop. In the creme de la creme, a butcher may be employed by a slaughter or self-employed. And God damn it, right then, I became a butcher with 1 week experience. I remember one of the cut room managers at the time was telling me that, like, oh, I worked at this one place and these slaughter guys, you should have seen them. They were real professional. And I remember thinking to the guy, fuck you, I'm getting paid. I am a professional. And he would look down or furrow down his nose when the kill floor would use the term butcher to describe themselves. He would be like, no, you guys were slaughter, you're slaughtermen. People who cut are butchers. And you do a quick, Google image search of the word butcher, and you're not going to see many people who were on our end of the industry even looking at the hashtag butcher. Back then, you didn't. And with the strive of always wanting to be the best and better, when I moved into the cut room at that facility and was made into a cutter, or what they considered a butcher at the plant, I found myself drinking the same shitty Kool-Aid and telling people who were still on the slaughter floor that they weren't butchers, that they were slaughtermen, and etc. Even though I used that exact same definition to define myself when it suited my needs, but I guess I just was being a bitch about it, and I was searching for that. I don't know if it's validation, but just like this whole idea of wanting to be. When you want to be the best, it means that other people can't be as good, and sometimes you're shitty and you put people down, and that's not cool. Even if it's all mental and you just don't let it out, it's still like an incredibly shitty thing to do, or to even have a mindset. And that plant was set up to make you feel like a piece of shit. And a lot of plants are set up that way. We had helmet levels. So you had a yellow helmet. That meant that you were either brand new or you were a rapper, and if you worked the rapping station, you were a yellow helmet. That also meant you couldn't really talk to the USDA. They couldn't ask you questions. If you had a red helmet, you've been there, about a few months. You knew kind of the ropes, you knew the routine, and you were still on the slaughter floor. And then if you had a blue helmet on the slaughter floor, it meant you knew every station, that you could seamlessly integrate yourself into any position on that floor, from knocking, to eviscerating, to landing. And all these things are not incredibly difficult to learn, but they're incredibly important to get right. Like building Legos, that if you fuck up, it's not going to go together correctly. And it's not going to be easy to go back and make your mistake. You may see your mistake, but you may not be able to correct it. What you certainly don't want to do is say, fuck this, and smash your Legos. You want to meticulously go back and correct it. So there you go. And this on the kill floor, this yellow, red, and blue helmet system created like a class system almost. And keep in mind, this is just a floor of 8 to 10 people at one time, and as small as 7 people. And to already have 3 systems of I'm better than you, not to mention that we're all seen less by the quote unquote butchers in the cut room, who all had green helmets. If you were cutting over there in the cut room, you had a green helmet to distinguish you from the yellow wrappers. And of course, guests to our plants had white helmets. This included the USDA because they are guests. And we invite them in, and this means that they are the lowest, obviously. Just joking if you're in the USDA and listening to this. So, of course, us on the kill floor started receiving animosity when we would call ourselves butchers by these people with their green helmets who've been doing this for so many years and blah, 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 blah. But you know what? Fuck them. This first piece is by David.
Happy spring, meatheads. Or, if you live in the same region as me, happy second winter. Seriously, this has been the gift that keeps on giving. I don't think I'm going to have pasture until June at this point, and I likely won't be able to get out to renovate a new pasture that I've got until probably late May, which means I won't be grazing it until September sometime. So I guess I'm crossing my fingers that it'll be a late season followed by a short winter to get back on track for next year. One of these blustery winter afternoons recently, I was reading an article that caught my eye. It was an interview with some fella that worked for a retail butcher shop that received their meats in whole carcass form. He made a comment about using certain nomenclature when referring to a meat service worker. He wanted to define some terms for the reading audience or the layman. He said, and this is to paraphrase as accurately as possible, butchers and meat cutters are not the same thing. Meat cutters pull subprimals from boxes, cut it, and throw it into a case. A butcher breaks whole carcass and then has all the other responsibilities. Kind of maybe saying that one job was more legitimate than the other, as far as being called a butcher. This really got me to thinking, because when I was really new to the business, I thought about stuff like this. It was important to me as a noob that lines were drawn because I had goals, and I guess I defined them using titles, which the longer you stick around something, the longer you realize that stuff is subjective and really doesn't matter at all. I was taught early on by coworkers that to be a butcher, you had to actively be, or at one point actively be slaughtering and cutting whole carcass simultaneously. So you had to be able to go, start to finish by yourself efficiently. They also said that if you cut boxed meat, you were a box jockey and not a real butcher. And again, the longer I stuck around, the more I realized that I disagreed with this point of view, and that it's pointless and self-righteous to think this way. The meat machine, as we all know, depends on each other, each and every one of us really, in order to keep the ebb and flow of money in, money out. The craft butchers depend on the big retailers, and the retailers depend on the meat marketers and the chefs and the small retailers. We all depend on the rendering company cutters and the value-added processors, and in our off time, maybe we depend on the seasonal boners or the game processors. In between all this, you find people like dead stock butchers, large-scale slaughter line workers, restaurant butchers, meat science professors, homesteaders, and special occasion butchers, like that one guy that the only time you call him is once a year, come out and kill your pig. He comes, does a good job, and then he leaves. And there's people like that too. So there's so many people working to keep this industry alive, it seems. Sometimes I forget the cogs that are behind the scenes. Some or most of them are so burly that they see a small retail shop cutting 1 to 2 beef a week as a retirement community, or like a sweet vacation or something. Let's take a look at some of these jobs. Let's start with the classic retail butcher. The job comes in many forms. So I'll just try to focus on aspects that I've worked in myself. One job I briefly worked for was a small family-owned grocery store. There was no fresh case or window. It was strictly tray pack, about, probably 30 feet of cold wall and a big cold well. Let's start with a classic retail butcher. This job comes in many forms, so I'll try to stay focused on a couple of types. One job I've briefly had was for a small family-owned grocery store. There was no fresh case or window. It was strictly tray pack, about 30 feet of cold wall and, kind of a middle-of-the-aisle cold well style refrigerator, like a reach-in. It held a pretty incredible amount of meat, well over a pallet worth, I'd say, if you were to weigh it. There was almost no customer service, because of the lack of a fresh case. Unless, of course, you got caught outside the department stocking or something. This store was in a pretty densely populated area, relative to the region. But it was also really isolated, so everybody in the area shopped here for their food. We get in boxes, subprimals by the pallet, and we'd also get cases of whole broilers to break down for the tray pack. For pork, we get whole shoulders, middle sections, picnics for sausage, and we get hams. We cut and wrap feverishly for 8 to 12 hours just to keep up with the demand. It was a very busy department. I'd cut a speed rack full of whatever, take me a long time, and then I'd wrap and price all of it. The guys I worked with there were total machines. The amount of precisely portioned uniform cuts they could produce in an hour was pretty impressive. I learned a lot about consistency, time management, and presentation at this job, which I took with me to other jobs, and maybe didn't totally understand it until now, but I learned a lot about efficiency in this setting, as well as another retail job that I had. This one was at the flagship store in Chicago for a certain certified organic grocery entity. My Oh no, this one was in the general Seattle area, actually. Our sales were about 100,000 a week, I think, 80 to 100,000, and the pace was super fast, and the customer service was a huge part of it, which, as we all know, is the whole next level of time management, figuring customer service into your daily tasks. Every person in this department depended on one another to deliver a fairly high quality product, to a large population of customers. Most of the cutters in this department, a lot of them had extensive whole animal breakdown experience. In fact, the head cutters and the team leader had been cutting since, I think, the late 70s, when grocery chains were still they're bringing in whole carcass and breaking on the rail. The reality is, though, while they love the old style of cutting from primals and subprimals has allowed them a steady paycheck, a schedule, and some kind of benefits. And the reality is, if we want to feed Americans meat diet the way that it is currently, if we want to continue to keep up a market that drives niche processors and retailers to stay afloat, we need a system of efficiency laying the foundation for everybody. As one colleague of the show said recently, there's plenty of high quality, conscientious producers out there working to supply grocers on a larger scale. This includes breaking carcasses and wet aging them to send out to retailers. Logistically speaking, it'd be completely impractical to handle quarters or halves on the large retail level at this point. And just because something comes in a shop whole carcass also doesn't mean quality. That's another thing. It's like more the spectacle that sells it, right? I mean, I've got plenty of burned up grass-fed milkers that were tough as leather and low in protein. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be having those in butcher shops, because we should be utilizing everything. But I don't know that I'd build a craft shop model on that particular product. I will say that I found out while I was at this job that you never know somebody's background, because you think somebody's like a grocery store cutter, whatever that means, if you have like some opinion of that, and you found out later that they did this and this and this and this, you had no idea, and it's you can really eat some crow, making assumptions of people like that. But anyways, let's hang up the primal cutter versus carcass cutter debate for a bit and look at some other jobs in the meat trade that I think are kind of interesting. Where there's livestock, there will be dead stock. This is a quote I'm sure a lot of us have heard regarding livestock. And so, honestly, I hate how true this is, especially this lambing season. But have you ever wondered what happens to these materials when they're sent away? Dead carcasses, that freshly dead carcasses. Dead stock companies come out to farms, stockyards, or slaughterhouses when an animal dies and needs to be disposed of properly. Oftentimes, these animals are beef over the age of 30 months. So what do these companies do with the carcasses that they pick up? Many of them bring them back to the facility for further processing. Many dead stock haulers have a butcher or two on the payroll, actually. Their purpose isn't to merchandise anything, obviously, but it's they're there to remove SRMs from carcasses. And then those get sent to a lined landfill. And then next, they break down the carcasses and send various items to different rendering destinations, depending on the outlets available. And there's similar jobs at some rendering companies, depending on the needs of their customers. They might have butchers on hand that take large usable chunks of meat off bone for further processing before the bones are sent off to rendering vats. Sure, these cutters might not be breaking whole carcass, but they probably know more about anatomy than your average butcher, because of all the boning they do. Speaking of boning, how about the production line workers? Talking about like large-scale processing facilities, boning line workers. Large processing plants might kill, 2,200 cattle a day. Facilities like this absolutely must exist in order to feed the public as the system currently stands. If you think there's room, if you think there's rooms full of like butchers breaking whole carcasses in their entirety at one of these places, you're mistaken. Like there's a plant that's relatively close to me, and like their kill floor is divided up into 87 stations, and so is breaking carcasses. It's like an assembly line. You never do anything. You never do everything. You do one task all day, every day for months. For example, 4 quarters hanging on a rail come through on the first station. It's on a timer. So you may have like 10 seconds to make the appropriate tracing cuts in order to outline the scapula for the next station. And then the next station will remove the clod, throw it on a boning table. And from there, somebody might make the opening cuts around the foreshank and pass that to the person to the right, who will then just remove the clod heart. And then each one of these moves happens in a couple seconds and can't really take any longer than the person next to them, because otherwise it'll hold the line up. So plants this size have each minute, each second defined by a dollar amount. If you can't keep up, you're either thrown in the skull boning room or you don't have a job, really. On the kill floor, like I said, their slaughter process is broken into 87 stations. 87. Can you imagine that? That means you might just open hides, or you might just trim the midline, or cut tongues, or slice necks 2,200 times a day, every day for months or years before switching stations. One might not ever see the whole process. On my kill floor, there's 3 stations. Dressing out, gutting, trimming. That's it. Recently, at Polished Gun posted a video of a burly dude on a production line. The 4-quarter would roll out on an automated rail, it looked like. He'd break the rib section off and the plate off with a handsaw. I think he chined it, and then he'd toss the parts to different boning line cutters. This all happened over the course of like 12 to 15 seconds. And then he'd turn for another one, and pluck it out of a long list of 4 quarters. The boners then likely take out, all the unneeded bones and pass the pieces along to somebody else, and so on and so forth. But this guy was a beast, and he was just breaking 4 quarters super quickly and passing them down to other people. A ton of repetition, keeping the same time all the time. The boning line butchers, I think, are some of the fastest, most efficient cutters in the world. These guys are amazing. The people who can bone a beef neck clean as a whistle in seconds. They might never leave that station. And if they do after, it's a long, long time, because, once someone is perfect at something and you want your production to work like a machine, why move them? Honestly, they're maximizing the dollars per second that they can earn. Can most boners break whole carcass? Probably not. Can they stuff a lamb saddle with pheasant and currant sausage, truss it, and garnish it with a pork fat rose? Fuck no. But are they butchers? Definitely. And most of these boners can make me and everybody I know look like a toddler with a knife. These butchers keep costs low, whether you're talking sustainable or commodity product. They just do. And until the populace reprioritizes their allocation of their funds to food over entertainment, these behind-the-scenes workhorses are continuing to do the thankless work that allows small artisanal shops to operate. Most of what I've been talking about so far has been red meat, but let's not forget about America's favorite protein, chicken. In many states, you can't sell chicken retail unless it's slaughtered under USDA inspection. And anyone who has killed chickens for production, and I don't mean killing 30 birds in a backyard setup with lots of time to take videos and stuff. I'm talking like real production poultry slaughter. It's thankless work, and it's cheap until you get into USDA inspected, and then it's quite a bit more expensive. And it takes workers getting paid close to minimum wage, working 8 to 12-hour shifts, with only one break in order to have these free-range happy chickens show up in a craft retail shop. Even the best birds you could find in Seattle, when I lived there, was processed in a plant that killed 20,000 birds a day. Many of these workers opt to wear adult diapers so they don't hold up the line. from what I've heard. Maybe that's a myth. I don't know. No one behind the small retailer's counter is including this in their sales pitch. Many of them don't even know it. Like I said, anecdotes of waxing poetic about bucolic pastoral scenes are relayed to the customer about their future bird dinner. Are these workers butchers? Hell yeah, they are. Because they allow me to do the work I do. We're all part of this holistic system, Too many people shit on the processing operations, but the fact is, USDA processors are doing their best job to provide cheap, efficient, and plentiful product to the masses. Regardless of whether you believe wet aging subprimals or dry aging whole carcass provides a superior product, it's up to you, These two ways of bringing meat into your retail operations are, however, both valid ways of doing business. There's plenty of high-quality producers that realize they'll feed more mouths by having their animals broken and boxed for shipment rather than insisting on shipping the logistically more difficult whole carcass. And each and every butcher that plays a role in that process is just as important as the next, including and especially those managing the waste stream. These are just a few of the jobs that aren't really in the forefront of people's mind when they think about, being a butcher. And I think it's naive to exclude any skilled meat industry workers from the label because A, you never know what skill set somebody has. Some people would rather work a job than be unemployed. And sometimes that means doing something that you've moved beyond. And, another reason you don't want to be exclusive with the butcher tag is because without all these people, the artisanal sector would go belly up. I think, like I said, it's a holistic system and we're all butchers. We're all meat service employees. And we're all just trying to make some money.
So before I got my anticipated green helmet, I worked on the kill floor. And if you remember, the kill floor was starting off, you're a yellow helmet. And when I was a yellow helmet, my job was to empty gut barrels and to trim faces and work the trim line, not to talk to the inspector, and scrape pig faces, use the brush torch. If an animal was being a dick, I would go out into the pens and get that animal inside. I would help with unloading. And at the end of every day, I would clean the pens and salt hides with the other yellow helmets. And management would come into the kill floor and they would ask people questions and they would talk over you. And, the overturn was so good that they didn't really care to learn your name if you were a yellow helmet because they figured you would be gone shortly. And when I worked there, in the first year, we had an overturn of 60 employees for a plant that only had 22 full-time staff. That's 60 people, over 60 people that came and went. Because working in a slaughterhouse as an entry-level worker sucks. If you don't believe me, or it can suck. If you don't believe me, watch the documentary, Thine is a Task of Blood by the Glass Walls Project. It's a European documentary, and they show people who are cleaners and doing all these jobs and the way that the rest of the kill floor is treating them. It's absolutely the same experiences that I went through. There's hazing. It's not like bad, but there's certainly like, I wouldn't be surprised if someone slapped someone with the broadside of the knives, or if you called in sick, you may come to work and your knives would be frozen in a lugger full of blood and you would have to wait to get them out, or, someone would leave your knives in the shit pile. Because even with the overturn, we are still a small facility. So when someone didn't show up for work, it just meant that terrible jobs of cleaning the pins or salting the hides just got spread out through less people. And that unnamed butcher, like working in the slaughter facility and going by the internet's definition of someone who is a slaughterman, that were we butchers? Were we butchers when we were shoveling that shit? Were we butchers when we were salting those hides? Well, there's money there. There's money to be made, and it's money made off an animal byproduct. And when I'm talking about an industry with a margin, and if you could spread that margin by charging so much per head, by charging so much per hide, and charging so much for final compost using the shit you cleared from the pins, and you're working at that facility to push that margin to the limits, then yes, I would say so. And there's been times in my career where I wouldn't, because I was just a petty dick and just wanted to be better and wanted to say, well, look where I am now. I'm not doing that. Now I'm a real butcher. But that's a shitty attitude, and I'm embarrassed that I've had that attitude. After a few months of working there, the kill floor boss, or the floor boss, got fired for egregious inhumane handling. He kicked a lamb in the face in front of the inspector out of anger because of something the inspector said. And that's not cool, by the way. I just want to preface that. This guy's an asshole. Fuck that guy. I think it goes without saying that what he did was not okay. And the owner of the company came out and let us all know he was fired right on the spot, essentially. And there's no warnings for that. And that's how it always should be. And he was all around just a shitty guy. You know, just to describe this guy, that he bragged about how inadequate he was at bed. He came to work one day and said, I had a dream, Travis, that you were sleeping with my wife. And it wasn't like it was just more like, isn't that weird? And I was like, yeah, I didn't know how to take that information. And he also didn't believe in the female orgasm. And he was proud that he would get to the finish line first. And to make matters worse, his wife worked in the office doing our scheduling. So he would say all this stuff in front of her, and she would blush and be awkward and be like, yeah, I've never come and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, ugh, this is awkward. Anyway, that guy sucks. He's an animal beating, unable to satisfy his wife cuck. He's also the person that told me that you should have seen these other guys. They were real professionals. Well, I got news for you, Jake. I'm still in this industry. And there's that pettiness. So with his absence, it allowed my brother to step into the role of floor boss, or management of the slaughter portion of the plant, which, due to nepotism, accelerated me through the program of helmets, but also eliminated some aspect that not only yellow helmets were cleaning out the pins, that everyone would stay and clean out the pins, and everyone would stay and salt the hides. Because if we all stayed, it would take 5 minutes versus 2 people doing it for 2 hours. And these pins, they weren't designed to get like a skid steer in there or anything. So you're doing this with, manure shovels, which are essentially like snow shovels. And when it's wintertime, the contents on the ground would freeze in the pens. And when it was summertime, it would be almost like 100 degrees with 98% humidity. And you just wanted to fucking die. And that's how it was on the kill floor too. In the summertime, it would be so humid that you felt like you're going to pass out. In the wintertime, there'd be frozen blood on the floor. And these conditions may be shocking for some people, hence the 60 people overturned within the first year of me working there. So over time, I learned all the stations on the kill floor, eviscerating, knocking, being able to manage the floor when needed, allowing management to take vacation, which meant I got my blue helmet, my coveted blue helmet. About the time I got that helmet, the cut room was understaffed, and I was already doing some cutting, without the eyes of the USDA on the weekend. Don't tell anyone. So I show up to work one day, and instead of my blue helmet and my blue jumpsuits that had my name on them, I had some white coats and a green hard hat. And the manager of the cut room came to me and said, all right, we're going to train you to be a butcher now. I was like, train me to be a butcher. What have I been doing for the last 2 years? I've been a butcher. I've been on the kill floor and all this stuff. And he's like, no, we're going to teach you how to cut meat. You're going to be an actual butcher. And then I was like, oh, okay. And then I did something shitty. I looked down and puffed up my chest and was like, well, I'm chosen, blah, 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 and all this shit. And what laid ahead of me was a very humbling road. My first job, I would break. I would be given lots of beef or pigs, and I would go into the cooler with a handsaw, and I'd primal them out, put them on meat hooks, keep their lot IDs in order of what we were going to cut them, and make sure that these were broken down and primaled for the cut room. Then I would push them on the rail, and then the cutters or butchers or whatever you want to call them would grab them, and they would have a corresponding cut sheet and go from there. And once I got sufficient at breaking, I was given 15 minutes to break a half. And then that's a long time when you're first starting out. Now it's nothing to me. It's more than enough time. But back then it wasn't. It took forever to get that H-bone off or to get the round off. And I would get lost in seams, and I would constantly have the head cutter coming into the cooler to point out mistakes or hesitant knife work or just things I did wrong. Then it was time to start more or less fine-tuning my knife skills and my dexterity. And once I was out of breaking, I broke for a few months. And it's an accelerated learning process because that few months I did well over a few thousand head. Not just of beef, but of pork and lamb. I would run the bandsaw on lambs. We'd have trees of lamb come in, 10 lambs per tree, and take a lamb off, and you would throw it on the bandsaw, and you'd literally have it on there for less than a minute, and then hand it out to the person who was doing this and doing that, and etc. And with pigs, you would, put them on a table, break them down with a well or a handsaw, and you would have it primaled out in 15 seconds. And that was my job. I primaled. I had to listen to, good music, good fast-paced music. And when it was time to, tune up a little bit my skills, I was moved on to the cutting block, but they just wouldn't give me anything. They would, for like a whole month, I would just do chucks. I'd read the cut sheet and I'd see a chuck primal, and it'd be like, all right, they want a boneless chuck roll. And I would bone it out and be like, all right, they want 7-bone steaks. So I'd cut it that way. Or do they want this? Or they want that? They want mock tenders. They want flat irons. Then there was the loin section of beef, which they never wanted to give the new guy. But to me, it's, looking back, it's one of the easiest things. You either pull the tenderloin and cut bone-in or boneless New Yorks, or you cut porterhouses. It's hard to fuck that up, in my opinion. But I certainly did. I know one time I was cleaning the tenderloin, and I thought the head, that side muscle in the head, was trim, and I cut it, and it looked just like a giant teres major because it had no defining head on it. And I was berated and made to be humiliated. But get over shit like that, especially when you got a beef coming down the rail in the next 15 minutes. And that's why we had that time frame, is because we were expected to clear that beef, our block, every 15 minutes and have it moved on to the wrappers. I remember I was working with this guy. He's a good friend of mine, and he was leaving to work for our competitor, another company. And one of the cutters is like, I wish him the best of luck, but he's young in his career and arrogant that he could be stuck and stunted without giving proper supervision. And that's something that I still, hold true, that you need people to push you. And I've talked to David about this because David hasn't worked with anyone better than him in 2.5 years. And he feels like his skills are slipping because there's no competitive edge there. That you need that competition to make you the best. This next piece is by Ryan.
For every one butcher that gains even a small amount of notoriety or fame, there exists a vast army of butchers that will never see the limelight. And make no mistake, it's not because they are less skilled at cutting meat or less skilled at slaughter butchery. These folks are often highly skilled. Some of the better slaughtermen and meat cutters on this planet will remain hidden from view, and their talent will never be discovered beyond the walls of the facility that they work at. Why is this? The majority of meat workers naturally will concentrate on building a local reputation for oneself and one's skill set, and that is usually good enough. In most cases, that's good enough to build a local reputation. It really never occurs to most meat industry workers that there might be any reason to launch a media campaign surrounding their skills. Social media is beginning to change this, but this is still a relatively recent trend. Another barrier to shining light on one's meat industry skill set is the fact that taking pictures and videos is prohibited in many meat-related places of work, especially in large-scale companies. The larger the company, the more they police their workers to protect against any unwanted attention from the outside, from the public. It is actually a felony in certain states for a meat industry worker to take a video or photo at their meat packing job. Felony. Big corporations make it their business to keep everything they do safely kept behind closed doors and out of the public eye. In Timothy Packerat's book, which is called Every 12 Seconds, he describes large packing companies as, quote, a zone of confinement, a segregated and isolated territory, invisible and on the whole inaccessible to ordinary members of society, end quote. There are two large meatpacking companies that I'm thinking of within an hour of where I live. Both are federally inspected. One of them processes a high volume of chickens, and the other kills and bones out a high volume of beef and dairy animals. At this point in my career, it is unlikely I'll ever work at either of these places. I very much like working in the smaller cut and wrap sector, the sub 30 beef per week type of business operation. But many, many folks that I work with in this region, both meat cutters, slaughtermen, and meat wrappers, have worked in one of these two high-volume facilities. Some of them have worked in those facilities for upwards of 10 years. I hear many stories about what it's like to work in these places. Two of my coworkers worked boning beef together there in the 80s, in the 1980s. They had their workflow set up so that one guy would run the bandsaw, and a number of other guys would set up at stations around the block. Chuck boners and round boners made slightly better pay than what would be called piece boners. There's no windows, no clock to see what time of day it was. They'd hold up their knife when it went dull, and one of the bosses would notice and would bring him a new one. Lunchrooms were so filled with smoke that it really didn't matter if you had a cigarette in your mouth. You were going to catch a buzz on the secondhand smoke. uppers would get passed around to keep guys working fast. Bone shiners, long hours, piles of rib plates to bone out, accidental injuries, dramas between employees. My coworkers mostly talk about the various personalities of the different guys they worked with there and how they also mostly talk about how sickly the work eventually made them, which was their cause to leave the company. Fast forward to present day, that same facility has changed. They kill more and they cut more now than they did in the 80s. They've remodeled their grinding room, revamped their workflow systems. All the boning now is done on the rail. Very little is done on the block anymore. They hire mostly undocumented immigrant laborers from Central America. This winter, I had a chance to work with several young men who had each done a decade as meat cutters at this large beef packer, and then had either quit or gotten fired and were now cutting in the custom exempt sector. These guys made my head spin by how fast and how precise they were at boning beef from the rail. To give you an idea of how slick these guys were, during the autumn busy season, 3 of them could custom cut 13 head beef or 100 elk across one 10-hour day. Damn. I asked them if there were guys faster than them at the facility they came from. Oh yeah, they'd say, some guys are faster. Though it sounds like a perilous underworld journey to actually work at one of these large-scale facilities, the folks that successfully make it through enough years there end up with a skill set that far surpasses any skill set in any other sector in this industry. And yet these highly skilled individuals are the most hidden from view compared to most every other niche in the meat world. The big business meat packing sector produces armies of incredibly fast and precise slaughtermen and meat cutters that we will never hear about, we will never meet, and will never see on social media. I've worked in big grocery retail, small craft retail, custom exempt, USDA in several regions of this country, and I have never seen anyone as hardworking and efficient as the 3 meat cutters from this big beef plant that I got to cut custom exempt with this winter. I came away from every day cutting with them feeling like, holy shit, this is the big leagues. Everything I had done prior to working with them felt like Little League baseball in comparison. I tried to tell them several times, yo, you guys are the best I've ever worked with. While they probably appreciated the compliment, I don't think they really got what I was trying to tell them. I was trying to say, you guys should be making more money. You guys could be finding job opportunities at many places with your skill level. It's very rare to come across someone as skilled as you. I'll be a reference for you if you ever need me to be. I was trying to say all these things to them. But there was a language barrier, so my points may not have gotten across. Also, even if they did hear what I was saying, it may not have computed necessarily. Because in the meat cutting world that they come from, there existed a critical mass of very high level workers. Likely in that context, there was nothing rare or exceptional about them, because there were many other workers that could also do what they did, and some that were even better at it than them. In that context, they were replaceable. The limelight is a strange thing. A chef who portions Wagyu tenderloins into steaks in front of a camera might be swarmed by adoring mobs of fans calling him a master butcher, and might get 1 million hits on all his videos and pictures. Might be considered an expert in the field because he has the gift of gab and a good stage presence. Whereas the legions of undocumented workers who are in fact the cream of the crop in our industry will never be seen, and their contributions will remain hidden.
So after working in the cutting portion of the plant, or butcher portion of the plant, I drank the Kool-Aid and started saying, well, I'm a butcher and you guys are slaughtermen and all that stuff. And I'd meet retail workers and they would tell me that they're butchers, and I'd be like, oh, but I'm a whole animal butcher. I'm a whole carcass butcher. And then I would meet other whole, quote unquote, whole carcass butchers, and I'd be like, oh, well, I have a slaughter background, and so I'm a whole carcass butcher and a slaughterman. I could take an animal from field to plate, so there you go. And I certainly had the skills, but I think this is what that butcher was scared of with the guy who was leaving, of being stunted in his career. I was mentally stunted in my career. And the bottom line, if you're a butcher, you want to call yourself a slaughterman, you call yourself a whole animal butcher, master butcher, craft butcher, ass butcher, all this stuff. What I'm trying to say is don't get lost in the terminology, because it doesn't mean anything. Your skills and your happiness should dictate everything. If you're going to shoot, don't talk. Just let your work speak for itself. If you're happy with what you're doing, then that's all that should matter. But if you want to strive to get that other notch on your belt and strive to be the best and all that, it may be a lonely road ahead. I've certainly had to deal with that in some aspect. And now just looking back and seeing what hindsight is, I could really tell you a lot of my thinking was just dumb and petty and had motivations for the wrong reasons. And it takes many people to achieve the casework that you see. That's the whole point. And that's what started this whole thing, is this whole idea of seeing these beautiful caseworks and all this shit, and people saying, well, I'm a real butcher. I get the whole animal. I did this. And somehow saying, like, people who work in a grocery store, they're just meat cutters. If you have that attitude, I'm sorry you have that, or that you see things that way. And it took me realizing how off-putting that attitude is in other people for me to change it in myself. Because we all want to be the best and we all want to be validated. But you don't want to be that way because you shit on other people.
I can settle down and be due.
All right, meatheads, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Meat Block Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked my rants. I was in a weird mood recording this one. It was kind of disappointing. Got some news that I really didn't want to get. So it kind of set the pace. Anyway, if you want to get a hold of us here at the Meat Block Podcast, you could do that by emailing us at themeatblockpodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet us at themeatblockpod. You could Instagram us at the Meat Block. And you could join our Facebook group, the Meat Block Podcast, or Meat Block. I don't know, but just type in those words on Facebook and you'll find it. You want to get a hold of Ryan, he is at Gather and Break on Instagram. David always is at A Farm Butcher on Instagram, and I am at American Butcher on Instagram and Facebook. And if you're looking for ways to support the show, the best way to do that, there are two ways to do that, but the number one way to do that is to leave us a comment and review and 5 stars on Apple iTunes. The second way to do that is by using the hashtag #TheMeatBlock on social media and tagging us on social media like Paddock to Plate, Ivers Farms, Rocky Red, 86, Norm the Butcher, Simon the Butcher, Seb's Butchery, Let's Eat 101, Basic Butch. Episodes in Whip right now, just to keep you on your toes. I'm looking for those retail horror stories or any horror stories. Just tell me. In something a little bit better than people just nicking themselves or something, you know. The first time we did the episode, we had a murder and someone threw a bucket of shit on the retail case. A human bucket of feces all over some fresh meat. That's crazy. And if you don't remember, go back and re-listen to that episode. It is quality. Other episodes in Whip right now, I'm working with something with Norm the Butcher from San Francisco, Go Niners, about the lack of diversity in the front of the housework of our industry. It is a subject as a white male that I'm uncomfortable talking about, but it's okay to be uncomfortable. And it is something that we should have a conversation about. Maybe look at how to change it. And if you have an idea for a topic, please let us know on all of those previously mentioned platforms. Until next time, keep your knife sharp and live in the margin.
And I'm gone, and at my grave you stand. Just say God's called home, you rambling